I had a few minutes to fish this morning, and we got cut really short because of fog. I mean, it was so foggy. I was afraid to be on the water. I stayed close to the bank and kept all my lights on. I could hear some boats running, so I was really nervous about that. So our date was really cut short. We only had a few hours to fish, but what my objective was, I wanted to catch a fish on topwater, I wanted to catch a fish on jerkbait, and I wanted to catch a fish on a square bill, and I wanted to catch a fish on an 8-foot bait, I wanted to catch one on a 10-foot, and I wanted to catch one on a 12-foot, and I wanted to catch one on jerkbait. I wanted to do that, and then we could talk about the water column. Well, I ended up running short. I ended up catching a couple on a jerkbait. I caught a couple on a CT8 crankbait, and I caught a smallmouth on the 8-foot running a little smaller profile, and I was doing exactly what I was talking about when I talk about covering the water column. I was getting the right bait to run the right depth to cover the water column. So I wanted to demonstrate that. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but we were able to catch a few, and I was actually able to watch one bite on my forward facing. So they came up after and I saw him. That was so cool. Little smallmouth. I saw him come up and get it. Let's talk about water column with hard baits. Well, obviously, the shallowest you can go is with a topwater bait. So that's a great way to go. Topwater is awesome, and a lot of times the topwater bait will draw fish to the surface. So if we're talking about covering the water column, let's start out, we've got a topwater bait. And then we can move over to a lipless crankbait. This little bait is an awesome bait, by the way. I really like this bait. People say, well, you make the pawpaw. This bait's totally different than pawpaw. This thing's got an incredible swimming action, and I can fish the water column with this from, let's say, 1.5 feet effectively to 7, 8, 9 feet. Really a cool bait. I like that lipless crankbait. Then a jerkbait. A jerkbait obviously is a bait that you can cover water column from. This particular bait will run about 5.5, and it's a suspending jerkbait. So I can get it down, if I make a real long cast, I can get it down on 8-pound test, trilene 100% fluorocarbon. I can get this thing down about 6.5 feet. Very effective for catching fish in clear water. I love a jerkbait in clear water conditions, especially when there is no wind. It's a killer. And then how about a lipless, a square bill crankbait. A square bill, and we got them in a couple of different sizes here if you want a smaller profile, but this bait is basically for me. Now, a lot of people use them in a lot of different ways, but for me, I use this bait in lieu of a spinnerbait. If I'm fishing in clear water and I'm bouncing off of stumps and trees and shallow stuff, that's when I like a square bill. And this is a killer square bill. It really is, and it's a CT 1.5. It's marked. It runs 1.5 feet deep. I can actually get it about 2.5 feet deep. But the rascal don't hang up. It runs at an angle, and it'll bounce off without hanging up. If it ran flat like that, you'd stay hung up, but this bait runs like this right here. And so it'll hit and bounce and go, and then if I want a bigger one, I call this the hand grenade, if I want a bigger one. But the way this lip is made and the way the flat spot is on the back of this bait, it fights each other. So it makes it real erratic, and man, I like that. I have caught a ton of fish on this bait, and I've hung up very little. So you think throwing it up against logs and stumps and running it by all kind of boat docks and rock piles and all kind of shallow water structure, you're gonna get hung up. I don't hang up much. So a square bill is a good bait from 0 to 2 foot deep, fishing around that structure and brush. And then how about if you wanted to go 8 feet deep, but you wanted a small profile? That's important. Sometimes fish are feeding on a little bitty shad. They don't want a big bait. They like that little bait. This little bait right here will run about 8 feet deep, and it's a killer little bait. It's called an alpha, and a Z alpha. I can't keep up with all the names, it's amazing to me. But it's got it marked on the back, it'll run 8 feet deep. I like that. Now I have to have reading glasses to see that, but I used to can see it. If you got good eyes, you can see it. It's marked. So again, you're covering the water column. We've gone from Topwater, we've gone to lipless, we've gone to jerkbait, we've gone to heavy cover, shallow water, we're going to throw the square bill. And now we're going to get into some smaller baits, but they'll still go 8, 9 feet deep. And just small profile, but 8 or 9 feet is important. And I've had so many people tell me, well, I'm gonna tell you, I'm not sure if I'm gonna fish 4 feet deep or 20 foot deep, so I just put on a 20-foot diving crankbait. That way when I throw it in that 4 foot of water, I got it covered. No, let me explain something to you. Really, really important, and it'll make all the difference in the world in getting bites. If you throw a 20-foot crankbait in 4 foot of water, it's gonna run like this. That bill's gonna be digging in the ground. It's not gonna run like a shad. You're not gonna see that pretty finish. You're not gonna see the side of that bait. All you're gonna see is the top of it, as that bait keeps digging in the bottom. So if I'm fishing 10 foot deep, I really like to have a crankbait that'll run 10 feet deep, because I want the profile of that bait to be sideways and not digging in the ground. I want it to be erratic. I want it to move. And when I stop it and jerk it, I want it to do something. I don't want it to just keep digging in the ground. That's the problem when you think you cover the whole gamut by selecting a crankbait that'll run 20 foot deep and you're throwing it in 10 and 12 foot of water. Bad choice most of the time. So to me, it's really, really important to get the bait that's in the water column that you want. And that's when we're talking water column, we're talking crankbait. Wherever that fish is, wherever they're located, wherever they're feeding, the best thing you can do is get a bait that runs that depth. Get it down there and let it be erratic. Don't get a bait that's just digging in the bottom. So many people make that mistake, and it's a bad deal. I love this little old bait, and it's marked on the side. This is called a CT8. Runs 8 feet deep. I can get it about 9 or 10 feet. Let me tell you, when they mark these baits like a CT8, it is designed to run 8 feet deep with like 12-pound line and with a monofilament line. If I put this on like 8-pound fluoro, I can get it 9, 9.5 feet, maybe 10 feet deep, not a problem. So always keep that in mind. Your smaller diameter lines are going to allow your crankbaits to go deeper. And so this is a CT8, I can get it about 10 feet deep if I drop back to 8-pound line. If I go up to 12-pound line, then it's a job for me to get it 8 feet deep. Then we got the CT12, and I get this bait sometimes, I get it down 13, 14 feet deep, but I throw it on light fluorocarbon line. And that's a trick from getting a crankbait deep. So they're marked, but you got all these different baits. Some of these baits are the same, like the 1.5, it's just 2 different sizes. Some of your 8-foot crankbaits, they're just 2 different sizes. If you want a low profile, small profile, versus a little bit bigger bait, kind of matching the hatch. A lot of people are really big on matching the hatch. If fish are chasing a 2-foot, 2-inch shad, I'd like to say a 2-foot shad, wouldn't you? Wow, you're gonna have to get out some big bait. If they're chasing a 2-inch shad, then they want a crankbait that's going to kind of mimic that 2-inch shad. If they're chasing a 3-inch, then you get a little bigger. If they're chasing a 4-inch, if they're chasing gizzard shad, then you go up to your bigger baits. So it's a lot of allowing the situation in the lake to tell you what size profile you need, and then wherever these fish are located to tell you what depth you need. But don't make the mistake of thinking, and I've done this so much, so I'm preaching to the choir. I need a mirror up here where I can look at it, because I'm really talking to myself. That deeper crankbait just digs in the bottom. Man, I want a bait that's got more of a horizontal profile and is erratic, and I think that is the key. So when we talk about covering the water column with hard baits, let's start out with Topwater, let's go to a jerkbait, let's go to a square bill, Let's go to our lipless bait, and then we'll get into our 8-foot, 6-foot, 8-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot running baits. And we cover that water column and select the right crankbait for the depth that you're fishing. And that is so important, and I think it's overlooked. And so I do talk in the springtime how important it is to pay attention to what happens in the spring, especially. You start out in the mornings, it may be cool, the water temperature, let's just say for illustration purposes, the water temperature is 60 degrees. Well, when that sun hits it, and by noon, 1 o'clock, that water temperature on the surface may be 70 degrees. Well, those fish just suspend up in that warmer water. So if you're throwing a crankbait that runs on the bottom, then most likely you're going underneath those fish and you're missing your target. But if you put on your little lipless crankbait, you can hold your rod tip up, you can hold your rod tip up high, and you can keep that bait in that water column where those fish tend to suspend up. So you don't want to go under or over your fish. And I'm going to tell you what I'm learning, and I still have a lot to learn. Forward-facing sonar. Fish do not like for you to get under them. They want you above them. And I've learned this in the last year and a half and 2 years, and it's more pronounced now than it was. I think the fish are getting more finicky than it was when we first started. I think the fish are realizing they're getting scoped. I think Omega Live is pinging them, and they know it. So it seems to me that I can get way more bites going above those fish than I can if I get down on their level, and especially if I go below them. Going below them is a no-no. I've watched them spook, and I'm gonna tell you real quickly, a little tip that I learned. I went to Rainbow Springs in Florida, and we observed in that crystal clear water. We had permits from the state. We were shooting underwater cameras, and Berkeley was trying to determine an invisible line. That's where their Trilene Green was born. It was born at Rainbow Springs in 1981 in a workshop, trying to figure out how we can make a line in crystal clear water invisible. That was before the days of fluorocarbon. But the one thing that I saw is we would throw past those fish, and the water's crystal clear, and we were down in a glass bottom boat where we could observe. Those fish would feel your line. I mean, you throw a plastic worm by them and you're 25 feet past them. And as soon as you start moving that line, that bass would react. And he's looking at nothing. He's looking at absolutely nothing. But he feels that water move. When you move your line, they feel that. And those fish wouldn't bite. And there was a new bait that had just come out in Uncle Homer Circle, the writer for Sports Afield magazine. He had something called a Sluggo. And it was before the fluke and all the finessed plastic minnows that we use today. But we started throwing that bait and just letting it free fall, not going past the fish. We just let it fall down to them and then swim it. Man, we started catching some giant fish. Rainbow Springs has got some toads in it, but you got to have a permit from the state. And we did, and we caught some really good ones. But the thing I noticed is throwing past them, that line bothered them. So I always think about that, and especially with forward-facing sonar, and I'm watching it. I'm watching it on my screen. I'm seeing a school of fish, and I bring a bait through them, it's like flushing quail. But if I bring that bait above them, sometimes I can get a volunteer to go and get it. So those are the things that I talk about when I keep talking water column, water column, water column. Is get the right bait to run the right depth and make the right presentation to those fish. It's the difference between catching fish and not catching fish. And just because we've got hard baits, that doesn't mean that we don't have to pay close attention to that water column and get the right bait to run the right depth, because that's when it performs the best. That's optimum. And that's what you want to do. So I think we overlook a lot of times the importance of getting the right bait to run the right depth when we talk hard baits.